Have you ever wondered why quiet strategic restraint could completely change the way we look at trade wars and, well, the presumed automatic dominance of American economic power? We are taking a deep look today at a really stunning geopolitical and economic pivot. The core conflict, it got triggered when President Trump announced fresh tariffs targeting Canada.
Right.
And the spark, it was highly political. It wasn't really about economics per se. There was an opposition ad in Ontario, and it used a clip from a 1987 Ronald Reagan speech.
Writing himself, yeah?
Yeah, Reagan himself criticizing protectionist tariffs. What followed was this dramatic escalation, seemingly based more on, political pique than any market fundamentals.
Definitely.
But the most powerful response to this move, it wasn't anger, it wasn't reciprocal tariffs. It was this strategy of calculated, almost disarming calm deployed by Prime Minister Mark Carney.
And that's really the crux of what we're analyzing here.
Hmm?
What looked like, or maybe was intended as, simple economic coercion, maybe aimed at humiliating Ottawa, has instead kind of illuminated a fundamental shift.
A shift in global economic power dynamics.
Exactly. Our mission today is to analyze that calculated calmness. It's really about understanding how Canada's response, which was far from being a sign of surrender or weakness, was actually transformed into a robust, long-term strategic advantage.
Okay.
This measured patience, you see, it's now fundamentally reshaping North American supply chains. It's accelerating Canada's global economic credibility, and critically, it's forcing core U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea to reassess the long-term viability of their allegiance to Washington.
It sounds like a major shift. Before we get into the details of exactly how this quiet revolution happened, remember to hit that subscribe button and support Geo9. Okay, let's unpack the immediate trigger first, because I think it really underscores the intensely political nature of this whole conflict.
Yeah, it does.
President Trump was already negotiating, or at least attempting to negotiate, this trade deal on steel and aluminum. Things were tense but moving.
Right, talks were ongoing.
Then, boom, the Ontario ad airs. And the ad, it was powerful because it used Reagan's own words from a speech he gave near the Canadian border back in '87.
Specifically calling out trade walls with neighbors.
Exactly. And Trump immediately called the ad fake, just like that. He ended months of intensive trade discussions.
Discussions that were apparently quite close to a resolution.
He slapped a new, immediate 10% tariff on Canadian imports. Just pulled the plug.
But that timing, well, it wasn't accidental, was it? It completely derailed months of pretty serious diplomatic work.
Yeah.
Negotiators from both sides, by most accounts, were genuinely close to finalizing a deal that would have eased those lingering 25% and 10% tariffs on steel and aluminum, respectively. The ones that had been in place for years.
So this just blew it all up.
Completely. The sudden, very personalized nature of the termination, it convinced analysts, look, this move was political theater. It was retribution, not based on any solid economic justification.
Right.
It felt like a demonstration of authority. Washington could dictate terms based on political grievances, never mind the economic cost to either side.
And that expectation of retribution, that's exactly why Carney's response was so effective, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Washington seemed primed for a counterattack. A reciprocal tariff, a harsh diplomatic condemnation, the usual tit-for-tat trade war script.
That's what everyone expected.
But as the Prime Minister was literally boarding a flight to Asia, his statement was just simple. He said Canada would stay ready to talk when the U.S. was ready to talk.
No threats.
No anger, just quiet readiness. It must have been baffling in D.C.
Oh, it was a masterclass in strategic deflection, really. A direct counterattack would have just legitimized the whole conflict. It would have played right into the U.S. administration's strategy of, leveraging chaos.
Okay.
By adopting that calm tone, Carney effectively removed the immediate political reward for Washington. And importantly, he forced the focus onto Canada's domestic strength.
So turn the attention earward.
Precisely. That quiet tone was, in effect, disarming, because it just broke that feedback loop of escalation. He shifted the narrative immediately. It went from how will Canada punish the U.S. to something more like how will Canada ensure its own economic security regardless of the U.S. mood.
That pivot to internal focus feels really key here. It represented a major, probably expensive, and certainly long-term strategic shift, right? Moving away from just relying on trade agreements alone to prioritizing domestic self-sufficiency.
Absolutely. And the government's message to Canadian industry, to citizens, it was explicit. Focus on what you can actually control. Build at home.
Build at home.
And this is where the policy moves become intensely tactical.
Yeah.
Ottawa's 2025 budget, it didn't just allocate money vaguely. It strategically committed hundreds of billions over the next decade.
Hundreds of billions.
Yes, specifically earmarked for industrial projects that ensure Canadian sovereignty over its own supply chains.
So what does that mean in concrete terms?
It means major investments in domestic clean energy generation, things like hydro and renewables. It means advanced manufacturing facilities, particularly for EVs and batteries, and shoring up industrial infrastructure, especially in critical minerals processing, something Canada has in abundance, but often shipped raw.
But let's get specific. What exactly does building at home look like on the ground? Are we talking general subsidies, or are these tangible, targeted infrastructure projects? Projects that could actually lure significant foreign investment away from, say, the U.S.?
Oh, it's very structural and intensely proactive. And it involves deep collaboration between the federal government and the provinces.
Okay.
For instance, they established something called the Green Industrial Transformation Fund. Think of it as a massive mechanism targeting capital for huge electric vehicle battery manufacturing hubs, primarily in Ontario.
Right, the auto belt.
And significant expansion of hydropower capacity in Quebec to ensure cheap, reliable, clean energy for those new facilities. That energy piece is critical.
And you mentioned speed.
Yes, the crucial difference is the speed. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec, they're utilizing new fast-track legislation. This allows them to bypass some of the bureaucratic hurdles, like lengthy permitting processes, certain environmental reviews, things that used to take years.
Streamlining the process.
Exactly. The message to global manufacturers is unambiguous. We offer stability, predictability, and fast deployment. Come here. We'll get you set up quickly and reliably.
But wait a minute. If Canada is pouring billions into domestic infrastructure to achieve this self-sufficiency, doesn't that inherently make Canadian goods potentially more expensive, at least in the short term?
That's a fair question.
Isn't there a critical risk here that they are simply building an expensive domestic protective wall, one that actually limits their ability to compete globally, especially against the giant U.S. market that, let's face it, remains their largest export destination?
That's the critical counterpoint, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was a risk many analysts flagged immediately. The strategy hinges on the difference between short-term cost and long-term risk reduction.
Ah, okay, risk reduction.
By stabilizing the input costs for things like energy and primary materials, and critically, guaranteeing political stability. Canada is essentially betting that the premium paid for predictability will eventually outweigh the instability and the potential punitive tariffs associated with manufacturing in or relying solely on the U.S.
So, trading reliance on unpredictable cross-border trade.
For stable, long-term domestic industrial resilience. It's a bet on stability over short-term price points.
And what's fascinating is that this gamble, this bet on stability, it seems to be paying off already, at least judging by investor confidence.
It does seem that way.
Statistics Canada reported a highly encouraging 14% rise in foreign manufacturing commitments. This was just in the first 9 months of 2025. And crucially, this new capital, it focused heavily on the energy and metals industries.
The very sectors directly targeted by those U.S. tariffs.
Exactly.
That data point, for me, is the most powerful evidence that the strategy of restraint actually works. Confidence is now flowing into Canada precisely because of Washington's instability.
So the instability south of the border became an asset for Canada.
In a way, yes. When foreign investors see the U.S. administration using tariffs as a political weapon, kind of arbitrarily, they actively seek predictable havens. Canada's calm approach, backed by concrete industrial policy, acted like a magnetic signal.
Right.
It proved that stability can be far more persuasive to global capital than confrontation and political maneuvering. Carney's calm, you could argue, has demonstrably translated into economic strength. So the trade breakdown with the U.S., it didn't cause Ottawa to just retreat and lick its wounds. Instead, it acted as a catalyst. It dramatically accelerated Canada's long-term plan for global expansion and diversification.
So as Washington was sort of closing the door,
Ottawa had already started opening multiple new ones. Across the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean. This wasn't just a reaction, it was an acceleration of an existing strategy.
and this strategic shift, it feels tangible. Carney's trip to Malaysia for the AEN summit, that's the Asia-Europe meeting, right? That wasn't just a photo op then. You're saying it marked the start of a structural realignment of Canada's global trade strategy.
Precisely. The goal isn't just to mitigate damage from the U.S. situation, it's more fundamental. It's about anchoring Canadian industries to multiple international markets.
diversifying the portfolio, so to speak?
Exactly. The AEN summit was crucial because it provided this high-profile platform to present Canada not as, a supplicant begging for trade,
Right.
but as a dependable, rules-based alternative for global supply chains. The plan is massive. Connect Canadian exports, particularly things like critical minerals, advanced technology, clean energy components, with Asia's rapidly booming economies,
So bypassing the traditional north-south dependence on the U.S.
and creating east-west channels of trade instead. It's a fundamental reorientation.
And are we seeing confirmation that this diversification push is being welcomed?
We are. Officials in both Japan and South Korea, key U.S. allies, are now openly describing Ottawa as a predictable and reliable alternative to the volatility they see coming from Washington.
That's significant.
It's very significant. And even Beijing, which, remember, is locked in its own complex and escalating trade battles with the U.S., even Beijing began to publicly frame Canada as a potentially stabilizing force in global supply chains.
Wow.
Chinese state media actually noted that Canada's reliability could effectively offset America's systemic volatility. Think about that. That is a truly profound shift in the balance of economic credibility.
Okay, the shift with Beijing, that's maybe the most unexpected and I guess politically charged element of this whole realignment, isn't it?
It certainly is. After years of really serious strain, remember the disputes over Canadian canola, seafood export?
And the detentions, the two Michaels. Very damaging.
Exactly. Major diplomatic freezes. Now, Ottawa and Beijing are actively rebuilding ties.
Yeah.
And this isn't just, normalization back to some previous state. It feels more like diplomatic necessity driven by hard economic realism on both sides.
And this diplomatic pivot, it reached a new level recently with Foreign Minister Anita Anand's visit to Beijing.
That was a big step. It effectively reopened high-level diplomatic channels that had been nearly frozen solid for years.
Right.
And now, reports suggest both sides are proactively preparing for a potential summit between Prime Minister Carney and President Xi Jinping, a meeting that honestly would have been almost unthinkable just a year or so ago.
Incredible turnaround.
And this diplomatic movement was immediately preceded by a really sweeping de-escalation of trade tensions initiated entirely by Ottawa.
Okay, how did that work?
This is where the policy detail gets complex, but also quite clever. The Canadian government published this sprawling 100-page order, and it unilaterally removed dozens of retaliatory counter-tariffs.
Okay.
But crucially, they did this on goods originating from both the U.S. and China.
Both. Why both?
Yeah.
If the issue was with the U.S. tariffs.
Because the primary goal wasn't retaliation anymore. It was domestic stability. They eased restrictions on previously restricted categories of Chinese steel and aluminum, for example. But simultaneously, they reduced tariffs on some U.S. goods, like specialized health equipment and certain construction materials.
Why apply the reduction to U.S. goods too, then? Isn't the point to push back against them?
No, the primary point at this stage is stabilizing Canada's own economy first. This move was intensely tactical. The auto sector is the perfect example here.
Right.
Those U.S. tariffs, originally intended to boost U.S. manufacturing, had this disastrous ripple effect in Canada. They contributed to decisions like Dantas moving its Jeep Compass production from Ontario down to Illinois.
Costing thousands of Canadian jobs. I remember that.
Over 3,000 jobs, yeah. So by easing these counter tariffs on input materials, regardless of whether they come from the U.S. or China, Carney is trying to stabilize input costs for domestic producers and directly combating inflationary pressures at home.
So it's an internal focus, using external policy levers. Less about punishing the U.S., more about helping Canada.
Exactly. It's about resilience at home first.
So the goal then is not really about choosing China over the U.S., which would be a massive risky step. It's more about dramatically restoring Canada's own leverage.
That's it.
In a world where Washington may be believed to control the entire economic board through threats, Carney is signaling, hold on, Canada still retains serious, viable alternatives, particularly in the East.
Precisely. Canada is reasserting its agency. And Beijing, naturally, is quick to capitalize on this opening.
How so?
Well, China's own economic growth has slowed down a bit, relatively speaking. They are actively seeking new, reliable trading partners, especially G7 democracies that might have strained ties with the U.S.
Canada fits that bill perfectly right now.
Perfectly. As both an economic partner and potentially a diplomatic bridge to the broader West. For example, Beijing is actively signaling willingness to lift restrictions on Canadian agricultural goods like canola and seafood, those long-standing irritants, potentially in exchange for concrete discussions about increasing Chinese electric vehicle imports into Canada.
A quid pro quo.
A mutually beneficial exchange, potentially, designed to restore that crucial balance of power that Canada felt it had lost.
But let's pause here for a second. If this is a necessary strategic move for leverage, what about the significant political and diplomatic risk?
It's huge.
Isn't opening up trade with Beijing now, after years of major diplomatic strain, the detentions, ongoing human rights concerns, isn't that politically perilous for Carney back home?
Absolutely.
Couldn't this be easily framed as an abandonment of Canadian values just for the sake of economic stability?
That is the tightrope walk, 100%. Domestically, there is inevitable criticism. You'll hear arguments that this is a compromise of principles, absolutely.
So what's the calculation in Ottawa?
The calculation appears to be strategic and long-term. The view seems to be that the U.S., under its current administration at least, has proven it won't hesitate to use its economic power punitively, even against its closest allies.
Like Canada.
Like Canada.
Yeah.
By contrast, China, while politically complicated, and that's an understatement, offers predictable high-volume market access that diversifies Canada away from near-total reliance on the U.S. market.
So the argument is independence requires flexibility.
Essentially, yes. The argument being made, implicitly or explicitly, is that true independence requires economic flexibility. And accepting a certain level of diplomatic complexity with China is the necessary cost of regaining that crucial economic sovereignty. They seem to be betting that voters, at the end of the day, will prioritize stable jobs and economic predictability over diplomatic purity, especially when faced with U.S. unpredictability.
A tough calculation.
Very tough.
And this diversification, it extends far beyond just China, right? You mentioned it demonstrates a much broader global vision.
Yes, that's important. Canada signed a new strategic roadmap with India in early October 2025.
India, okay.
And it specifically restarts cooperation, focused on critical minerals again, a key Canadian strength, renewable energy, and technology exchanges.
Why India specifically?
That move with India is vital for the long term. It opens a crucial gateway to South Asia as a rapidly growing market, and it acts as a hedge against volatility in both the U.S. and China.
Interesting. So not just replacing U.S. dependence with China dependence.
Exactly. As global supply chains continue their major shift, trying to move away from dependence on just those two centralized hubs, Washington and Beijing securing access to emerging dynamic markets like India ensures Canada remains relevant. It keeps Canada anchored in the developing world's growth engine. It's really about trying to be truly non-aligned economically, especially when the giants are clashing. Now let's pivot a bit and analyze the strategy Washington was using, not just with Canada, but with other key allies. It's a model we can pretty explicitly define as cash for relief.
Cash for relief. Explain that.
It's essentially the U.S. strategy of using the threat of tariffs, or conversely the promise of tariff reduction, to demand massive mandated financial commitments from its allies.
So pay us, and we'll lower the tariffs we impose.
Or pay us, or we'll raise the tariffs. It's using trade policy as leverage for direct financial extraction, basically. This predatory model was presented to Canada, and the fact that it's also being deployed against Seoul and Tokyo is what seems to be finally driving those key Asian allies to pull away and look for alternatives.
Okay, let's look at South Korea. We saw a very immediate and very public breakdown of trust there.
We did.
President Lee Jae-myung, he publicly refused to sign what he forcefully labeled an unbalanced trade pact. He argued it worked actively against Korea's core national interest. That's strong language.
Extremely strong. It was an unprecedented public rejection of a U.S.-driven trade framework by a major ally like South Korea.
And the U.S. response, was it to renegotiate, to find common ground?
Not according to reports. The response was apparently to escalate the threat. Washington immediately threatened to revert tariffs on key Korean goods, things like steel, electronics from the recently reduced 15% level back up to the original, much higher 25% rate if Seoul refused to sign the deal on the table.
So accept our terms or face higher tariffs.
Pretty much. And the pact itself, the deal they wanted Korea to sign, it was structured less like a typical trade agreement and more like a mandatory tribute payment.
How so?
It included a staggering, apparently non-negotiable $350 billion investment commitment from Korea into the U.S.
350 billion, that's enormous.
Huge. And it came with specific stipulations demanding essentially U.S. oversight or control over related intellectual property and mandatory localization requirements for key manufacturing processes within the U.S.
So the U.S. wasn't just asking for money. They were demanding structural control over future Korean industrial development, limiting their ability to innovate independently.
That's exactly how Korean officials seemed to view it, as fundamentally compromising their national, technological, and economic sovereignty. For them, paying the $350 billion, as enormous as it wasn't even the main issue.
Really?
It was the lack of control over where and how that money was deployed, combined with those mandatory technology transfer clauses. It meant, in their view, they would essentially be financing their own long-term disadvantage.
Paying to fall behind.
It was viewed as coercion designed to strip Korea of its competitive edge in key future sectors, like advanced computing, biotech, things where Korea is a global leader.
And the tension, it reached a boiling point with that highly visible incident, didn't it? The raid.
Ah, yes, the raid.
Yeah.
It became a major diplomatic headache. U.S. immigration authorities conducted a very high-profile raid on a Hyundai electric vehicle plant that was currently under construction in Georgia.
Right when tensions were high over the trade pact refusal.
Exactly. The timing and the target were devastating, diplomatically speaking. The raid specifically targeted technical teams, specialists flown in from Korea to oversee the installation of complex, specialized manufacturing equipment.
What was the official reason given?
The official reason involved routine visa checks, documentation issues. But the disruptive effect was immediate and significant. Work stopped completely. Key personnel were detained, questioned for hours. The project suffered major delays.
And how did Seoul react?
Korean media immediately framed this as a deliberate act of political harassment. Humiliation, even, especially coming right after President Lee James' public refusal to sign that unbalanced pact. It looked like retaliation through bureaucratic means.
What was the lasting impact of that incident on U.S. credibility, do you think? In Seoul, but maybe broader, too.
It created a profound and likely lasting trust deficit. When one U.S. government agency is simultaneously promising massive benefits for investment in the U.S., while another U.S. agency is actively disrupting your technical teams, creating legal jeopardy for your key personnel.
It sends a very mixed, very negative message.
The message to Seoul was crystal clear. The U.S., right now, is an unreliable and politically volatile destination for major capital investment. Korean officials now speak openly, if privately, about the difference between cooperation and what they perceive as targeted coercion. And this naturally drives them toward more predictable partners.
Partners like Canada, perhaps?
Like Canada, potentially, yes.
And a similar unease seems to be building in Tokyo, despite decades of what always looked like an unbreakable alliance.
It does. The broad trade agreement between Japan and the United States, it remains conspicuously unsettled. That's the official term being used.
Unsettled. What does that mean practically?
It means crucial annex orders.
Yeah.
The detailed parts covering sensitive sectors like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, they're just missing. They haven't been finalized.
And is this just bureaucratic lag or something more?
Sources suggest it's something more. The problem isn't just paperwork. It's fundamental disagreement over the financial demands being made by the U.S.
Ah, the cash for relief model again.
It appears so. The U.S. reportedly demanded a massive 550 billion yen investment package from Japan. That's roughly, what, 4 to 5 billion U.S. dollars, depending on the exchange rate?
And where was that money supposed to go?
Explicitly aimed at rebuilding American infrastructure and industries, specifically in areas where Japan actually holds technological leadership, like advanced semiconductors and shipbuilding.
So Japan paying to rebuild U.S. competitors.
That's how some in Tokyo are framing it. Japanese officials are deeply concerned that this blurs the line between a trade agreement and an outright tributary payment.
Why does this feel like tribute rather than just, normal trade negotiation or investment?
Because the investment was reportedly demanded as a prerequisite to finalize the trade deal, not as a natural consequence or outcome of it.
Pay first, then we'll sign.
It was positioned effectively as payment for reduced tariffs, like purchasing market access in the U.S. rather than achieving it through open negotiation based on mutual benefit. Tokyo feared that complying would cost Japan both its financial leverage and its diplomatic independence in future negotiations.
Setting a dangerous precedent.
Exactly. A precedent that the U.S. could always demand billions up front for any future deal. This hesitation from Tokyo, this digging in their heels, it's historically significant. It's arguably the first time in modern history Japan has openly and consistently questioned the fundamental fairness and structure of a core U.S. trade arrangement.
So this shared experience of coercion, Ottawa, Seoul, Tokyo, it's forging unexpected new alignments based on a shared risk assessment of the U.S.
It certainly looks that way. Shared vulnerability can be a powerful catalyst for new partnerships.
Fascinating. If you're finding these insights useful, take a second to subscribe to Geo9. It really motivates me to keep sharing more research stories like this.
Okay, so let's talk about the ultimate irony here, how this trade aggression is playing out right back here in the U.S. The tariff wars, which were, at least publicly, intended by the administration to protect U.S. jobs and strengthen domestic industry.
That was the rhetoric, yes. They seem to have instead created almost impossible planning conditions for businesses, soaring input costs, and frankly, a chilling effect on capital investment right here at home. The boomerang effect seems undeniable.
The lack of predictability is just devastating to long-term business planning. It really is. The National Association of Manufacturers, not exactly a radical group, they issued stern warnings. They said the constant threat of tariff increases, sudden shifts, reversals, it's actively eroding predictability across the entire supply chain.
And manufacturing needs predictability.
Absolutely.
Yep.
It operates on long timelines, years, sometimes decades. Volatility kills confidence, kills investment. Furthermore, we started seeing the political consensus erode too. Reuters polling indicated a notable slip in support for the administration's trade policy, especially in key agricultural states.
The Farm Belt, yeah, where cross-border exports were crucial.
Exactly. Communities where those exports once formed the economic backbone. They were feeling the pain directly from retaliation.
And this uncertainty, is it actually translating into businesses holding back on spending, a capital strike, so to speak?
The data suggests yes. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce reported that a staggering 62% of mid-sized manufacturers, the engine of the economy, in many ways they either delayed or completely canceled investment decisions.
Like what kind of decisions?
Things like buying new machinery, expanding plants, hiring, all put on hold specifically because of this persistent trade uncertainty. Tariffs might generate immediate headlines, maybe some short-term political gain, but they fundamentally destroy the confidence that an economy relies on to grow long-term. And the costs, they're not abstract. They hit consumers, they hit businesses directly. American construction firms, for example, reported material costs rising by nearly 12% since early 2024.
Wow, 12%. That impacts housing affordability, infrastructure projects.
Everything. And more critically, sophisticated economic analyses estimate that U.S. consumers are now shouldering about 55%, maybe more, of the total cost of all these tariffs. Through higher retail prices on imported goods, obviously, but also through reduced competition, which allows domestic producers to raise prices too. The policies are effectively acting as a hidden tax on American consumption, not really as effective protection for American industry in the long run.
What's truly remarkable, though, is that instead of bending to Washington's will, these aggressive policies seem to have inadvertently pushed allies to unite, to actually increase trade with each other.
Right.
The U.S. tariff regime has almost become this global rallying point against protectionism for rules-based commerce.
It's the great unintended geopolitical consequence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Japan and South Korea, after their respective encounters with that cash for relief model, they are now openly and collaboratively calling for predictable, transparent, rules-based trade. They're coordinating their messaging.
And Europe.
The European Commission has issued highly critical warnings. They've stated that American protectionism now represents a systemic, a dangerous risk to the stability of the global economic recovery post-pandemic. And the quantitative data, it confirms this collective backlash.
What does the data show?
World Trade Organization data shows that global tariff retaliation against U.S. measures now covers well over 40% of all American exports.
40%? That's huge.
It's massive. The strategy designed to isolate rivals is actively isolating the United States itself on the global stage.
Which brings us, I guess, to the ultimate irony. The shifting gravity of capital you mentioned earlier. The America First strategy is, paradoxically, isolating America.
While Canada's strategy of patient restraint is allowing it to potentially capture some of that diverted capital and trade.
How specifically?
Well, Canadian importers are now finding, in some cases, that Chinese metals and key industrial components are structurally cheaper than the equivalent U.S. products.
Why?
Precisely because the U.S. materials are weighed down by the administration's own tariffs, or the retaliatory tariffs they provoked. It's completely counterintuitive.
So Canada can import from China more cheaply than from its neighbor?
In certain key sectors, yes. And this is having real-world consequences. For example, European automakers, big global players, they are now openly eyeing and reportedly planning major joint ventures in Canada.
Why Canada specifically?
Their motivation seems twofold. First, obviously, to bypass existing and potential future U.S. tariffs on finished vehicles exported from Europe. Second, and crucially, to access cheaper supply chains, including potentially those Chinese materials that Canada is now strategically, if cautiously, welcoming back into its markets after lifting retaliatory tariffs.
A tariff avoidance platform with access to cheaper inputs.
Exactly. This flow reversal, it could be significant. We're talking potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in capital, money that might have originally been destined for new U.S. factories investment from Japan, Korea, even Canadian firms themselves. It's potentially being redirected.
Redirected where?
Analysts estimate this massive redirection of investment could happen over the next 3 years or so, flowing instead toward more politically predictable and economically stable markets.
Like Canada.
Like Canada, potentially Mexico, parts of Asia. Markets that offer stability.
This really demonstrates that core paradox you mentioned, that power relying solely on relentless threats, it loses its value once those threats maybe don't scare people anymore, or the cost of compliance becomes too high.
Right. Carney's calculated restraint, in a way, exposed the vulnerability of the U.S. position. It showed there were alternatives. The lesson seems undeniable. Influence without credibility is inherently fragile. By attempting to command loyalty and control its partners through sheer economic pressure and coercion, Washington unwittingly taught its closest allies from Ottawa, right on its border to Seoul across the ocean, exactly how to operate and maybe even thrive independently.
They learned to hedge their bets.
They learned to build resilience and the potential for that upcoming Carney-Xi summit, regardless of the ultimate outcome or the political complexities. Just the fact that it's realistically on the table, it symbolizes this evolution. It proves that middle powers can successfully navigate and perhaps even capitalize on the friction between the global giants.
They're creating a third way, maybe.
Absolutely. They're forging their own path, refusing to be just pawns in someone else's game.
So what does this all mean for the future then? I mean, the U.S. still possesses enormous geopolitical and economic influence. Nobody's denying that.
Of course not.
But if its closest neighbor, Canada, and core democratic allies like Japan and Korea are actively rewriting their economic playbooks, connecting west to east rather than relying exclusively on that traditional north-south axis with the U.S., what does the future economic map of North America and maybe the world truly look like?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? The lines are definitely being redrawn.
So what's your take on this? We've covered a lot of ground. Share your point of view in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Geo9 so you don't miss future insights like this one.